that's what leads to the tragedy of the commons. That's what leads to maintainer burnout. That's what leads to people not understanding that they can't just take this stuff out of the ether and use it without.
Most bugs are not vulnerabilities, but at our level there are. So we start issuing them. And over last year, I did the math the other day because I have to give a talk. We had 10 a day. 10 CVEs a day. Now, the funny thing is we have 30 million lines of code in the kernel, right? So all the drivers.
A bunch of aggressive tech people who are geniuses who want to reach out. Well, we have to educate them on what it looks like to be gentler with the broader population. And wow, at some point, people realize that
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Gotti,
Open source is interesting.
Claire Dillon,
Great collaboration,
Wayne Starr,
Freedom,
Stephen Wally,
Good engineering,
Austin Bryan,
community,
Tom Sadler,
collaboration,
Greg Kroah-Hartman,
The best way to develop software.
Federico Gonzalez Waite,
limitless,
Amanda Brock,
the future,
Gregory Kurtzer,
collaborative,
Michael Dexter,
freedom.
Ria Farrell Schalnat,
Endless learning.
and Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Hello, everyone. This day has come again. And if you wonder what day it is, this is the day of the finale episode for season 2. I brought you some segments from this season that we recorded with Bill and our guests, but they haven't aired yet. And the 4 segments that I picked for today are resembling the big talking points that we had throughout season 2 on the podcast. I got this feeling recently that the open source ecosystem is going through a little bit of a change period. And this is because how the world is starting to recognize that modern life depends on connected digital infrastructure. And with that, it is very prone to cyber attacks, and therefore security and cybersecurity are in the focal point. And when it comes to digital products and services that, for example, governments are paying more attention to, well, we mentioned it quite a few times that they all have open source software in them. They are either part open source or they are depending on open source tools or libraries. So there really is no way around. When we talk about digital infrastructure, we do talk about open source code, and we also talk about open source communities. And when it comes to securing the infrastructure and the environment that we live in this, well, big chunk digital world these days, it really is a responsibility for everybody to chip in and maintain not just the proprietary code, but also the open source code, and start to invest in the open source projects that we are using and relying on. Along these lines, one of the big topic areas for season 2 was legislations. And we talked about governments and how they have been approaching open source. We mentioned examples in the United States, in the EU, and we also had a guest on this season, Federico Gonzalez Waite, who talked about how the Mexican government is approaching open source. And their way is very different from most other governments in the sense that they decided to fully embrace open source and create and roll out policies. So having the government and government agencies implement their own tools and own infrastructure stack and services through using open source software. And that also trickles down and out to the private sector and also education and academia in the country. And then it's starting to take effect in the region as well, which is amazing to see. What we talked more on this season was the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a new legislation that got approved and accepted in the EU. It was created by the EU Commission the end of 2024. So that is one of the big news items in the open source space in terms of regulations and legislations. And while the legislation itself is approved, the next steps in terms of how the processes and workflows will look like at the end, that is still cooking. In season 2, we had an amazing chat with Ria Farrell Schalnat, and she has a background in law and also tech. So we covered how these two intersect, and we talked a little bit about the legal community in the open source ecosystem. And with Ria, we touched on legislations as well. And this next segment covers a short conversation about the Cyber Resilience Act, but also touches on the importance of covering open source from all aspects in education and academia. Enjoy this segment with Ria.
And not just the languages, not just the licenses, not the projects that are at open source or the key projects that you might learn the functionality behind or even the legal rubrics that apply. But I think some aspect of the ethics and philosophy of open source really should be part of the undergraduate experience, because if you don't understand the responsibility that is inherent in engaging with open source and utilizing open source, that's what leads to the tragedy of the commons. That's what leads to maintainer burnout. That's what leads to people not understanding that they can't just take this stuff out of the ether and use it without giving back.
Well, technically they can, but...
Okay, yeah, you're right.
Well,
They can, but it's not a long-term sustainable approach. And I think that philosophy ought to be imbued in the next generation coming up.
Yeah, there are consequences to that decision.
Yes. Well, not to make us go down a rabbit hole, or maybe I do want to make us go down a rabbit hole, but apply that to the legislation that's been coming out, because in a sense that says, hey, if you want to use this stuff, you have some level of obligation, at least to your users, that you're sure that there's no vulnerabilities in this software, as one example. And, actually advocating in legislation that if you make a fix to software that you're going to ship to your customer, you should give it back to the community from which you got it. Do you see that as being a method of moving along the ability for open source projects to have that ethos more in a regulatory form as opposed to an ethical or a philosophical form, actually having legislation that tries to say, the same types of things and buttress that ethical aspect with actual legislation.
That's a great point, Phil. I think cybersecurity may be a real driver for some of the reform that needs to happen across the open source ecosystem. The whole concept of software bill of materials, or SBOMs, really hit their stride about 4 years ago with President Biden's Executive Order 14028. And that piece of regulatory weight that was put out has spawned an entire ecosystem of its own around open source, led by Dr. Alan Friedman with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency under the Department of Homeland Security, or CISA. That's on the US side. On the world stage, the European Union now has the EU Cyber Resilience Act that I think includes some of those things that you were just mentioning about looking at vulnerabilities and ensuring that you have some kind of responsibility for support and maintenance. That is bringing to the forefront this idea of that level of responsibility, at least to your end customers, if not to the broader ecosystem and community, but they may benefit from that as well.
Yeah, to my understanding, like the Cyber Resilience Act is going towards, if you have a vulnerability in the product that builds on an open source project and the vulnerability is present in that project, and you are like that product is obviously something that you make money on, then you as a company will be obligated to disclose and report that vulnerability to the open source community. And I don't know if like how far the legislation currently is and the next steps on how they are enforcing things. But I think there might be some obligation even on the lines of, if you have a fix, then you should also share that with the community, and whether that fix is what is getting merged and will actually fix the vulnerability or somebody else's, that I'm not sure. I don't think that matters at the end, but there is some notion towards both report the bug and take part in fixing it as well, which personally, I am super happy to see a direction that puts the idea and has some enforcement around companies actually investing in open source. And one thing that I think communities need to also prepare for, that once this actually starts to happen, we already mentioned maintainer burnout. Now, I would love to see the problem where we have so many new companies and people showing up and reporting and trying to fix bugs that it is going to become like a big load for the maintainers. But on the other hand, any increase in load might result in, already busy maintainers burning out over time. So that's something that I think the communities will need to keep in mind, how to enable those people who show up, whether because they realized that what they were doing is not sustainable or they were incentivized by something like the CRA. So once they show up, that they're able to efficiently figure out what and how to do without becoming like, a big burden and source of conflict, and not conflict, but challenges on, we have all these new bugs and things, and now we don't know what to do as a community. And if I said anything that is not accurate, Ria, please correct me.
I think you've got a really good sense of the overall ecosystem and the push and pull, because there's just so many competing interests and so many areas where the sand is shifting under our feet that we're trying to figure out as we go along. You mentioned the EU CRA was passed last year, but those are just the bones of the framework. The standards bodies are now trying to put flesh on those bones of hammering out exactly how will this area be interpreted, what will be the specific requirements, who are you going to report to, what kind of infrastructure is going to be set up to handle all of this. So stay tuned. We live in interesting times.
We really do. As we keep saying, there's always something new to learn and figure out every single day in open source, which makes this area really interesting and kind of fun to be a part of, because you never get bored.
I think my tagline for open source is that it is simply endless learning. You are always learning something new in it. And I've been doing this now for off and on over 20 years. But the more I learn, it's unlocking the more I have to learn. There's always a new trove of information or procedure or process that you can layer into the mix to make it better.
Hopefully, I think you phrased it really well, Brienne, in saying that let's hope that it is a good stepping stone to aiding in the maturity and the evolution of the interactions that happen between companies and the open source projects on which they rely, to really build a better partnership. Let's start with vulnerabilities, but let's see if we can take it further.
As we talked about the Cyber Resilience Act in the last segment from, responsibility perspective, I think it is also very important to talk about why the CRA was put in place, and that is security and cybersecurity. And this is very important because all of our lives depend on digital infrastructure, and that infrastructure has to be secure. Like, just thinking about my own life, I have 2 mobile phones, I have a laptop, I have a tablet. I communicate with people mostly online through the phone, emails, text messages, chat messages. I think I'm part of a large group of people who do shop online as well. Not groceries. I still go walk to the grocery store. But when it comes to some clothing items, some electronics, and who knows what else I feel like buying that day, I do shop online. I stream movies and series online. I have, my personal information available online, and we get new news articles on a daily basis about, passwords leaked, personal information leaked. And very soon it will affect the everyday person like I am, much more than in the past. More and more often you get attacked rather online than physically. So we have to protect this space. And with open source projects being fundamental building blocks of modern digital infrastructure, it is very important to make sure that any vulnerabilities in those software components get fixed. And in some cases, if we are talking about a lower level component in the stack, every bug is a potential vulnerability. And this is what we talked about with Greg Kroah-Hartman in this next segment, where he shares how technically every bug that they discover in the Linux kernel could be a vulnerability, because that is the base foundational layer of the software infrastructure stack. Enjoy this segment.
Well, and I mean, this is really taken over the software industry in the last decade, right? I mean, because any given application has, hundreds to thousands of dependencies, and that's all the open source ecosystem doing a wonderful job of providing great functionality. But now management of that functionality, most importantly, the CVEs and the vulnerabilities associated with those dependencies, is now what's really coming back to require management.
Yeah. And it's just, but I mean, yeah, it's again, you're just being forced to do good engineering practices. It's nothing you shouldn't have been doing in the first place, right? I will push back on you hard as someone who was the manager of an engineering department. Yeah, you better be doing this type of stuff. And the CVEs are fun. So the Linux kernel is now a CNA, and a CNA is a certificate numbering authority. And that means we are now responsible for all CVEs, and CVE is common vulnerability expression numbering. What does CVE stand for? It's a number. A CVE is just a unique ID for a bug. It was created like over 20 some years ago. So you could say, you don't have to say the second paragraph on the third page of that website is the bug description. You can have a commonplace for these. And CVEs have grown over the years. It's a vulnerability. It's a fix for a vulnerability. And you can track them across products because, like you say, the dependency chain is huge. You want to know that it's fixed in your version of your device and whatnot. That gets messy when you see companies backporting fixes and don't bump version numbers. So it's hard to do things like that. But for the kernel, we always resisted this because dealing with this is because we thought of it as a joke. Any bug at our level is a security bug. We treat a bug as a bug. We want to fix bugs and move on. We fix known security issues every week. We fix unknown security issues even more. So we ignored it for forever. But it turns out with the CRA and other laws that are coming up, we have to be responsible for documenting all vulnerabilities as if you want to use Linux. So we applied to be a CNA. Before, we couldn't do this stuff. The CVE group, you had to be a company to do this. But now, thanks to Python, I'll call it Python, blazed the trail for everybody to say we want to be responsible for our own numbers, our own vulnerabilities. Please let us do this as a nonprofit, as a bunch of individuals. Python did that. OpenSSF, the Linux Foundation, wrote up the documentation for everybody. A bunch of other projects have done this. Curl, Daniel from Curl has done this. I did this for the kernel and other open source projects. I recommend everybody do this. But so now we're responsible for documenting all bugs, right? And all vulnerabilities. And the definition of the vulnerability is very specific. We have to go by that. So we start issuing them. And bugs at our level of the stack is very interesting because any bug at our level could cause a problem. It could cause you to reboot, could cause you to lose memory. These are all vulnerabilities. Traditionally, most bugs are not vulnerabilities, but at our level, there are. So we start issuing them. And over last year, we did the math the other day because I have to give a talk. We had 10 a day, 10 CVEs a day. Now, the funny thing is we have 30 million lines of code in the kernel, right? So all the drivers for the code for all hardware is in the kernel, all the architectures. We got rid of Itanium. Sorry, finally. But all the architectures are together in the kernel. No foul. So I did the math. So every CVE that we issue, we say, touch this file, right? And when you build your kernel, you're only building a subset. So like if you look at my laptop, it runs 2 million lines of code. You run a server, it's 1.5 million lines of code. A phone runs 4 million lines of code. Phones, from a computational point of view, are the most complex beasts out there, much more so than servers. Servers are really simple. So I did some math. I took a random week, and I said, how many CVEs or these vulnerabilities actually applied to the code that was built for Android? To look at that. And 10 were there for a week. So that's 1/7 of them were applicable. Now, a lot of these, we don't give a grade. We don't say how severe they are, be they minor, major, because I don't know how you're using Linux. Anything could be, in your instance, could be trivial or not be an issue at all. It depends on if you do this. Famously, phones, if the kernel ever spits out a warning, the phone has an option that'll reboot just because they want to be safe, which is good. Servers sometimes do that as well. But that means that was a vulnerability because I got your phone to reboot. So I have to classify this. So I don't grade them. So then I looked at Apple and Microsoft. And for that same week, Apple and Microsoft had 10 issues, maybe 9, 11. And then somebody told me that Microsoft only documents their high bugs for their operating system. So if you look at that, we're actually doing better than the other operating systems out there, or the same. It's fine. So all operating systems are bugs at our level, are considered vulnerabilities. There's a lot of them. Again, 10 a day is what we're issuing, which about 30 changes to the stable kernel go in per day. So 1/3 of the fixes that would go into the kernel are a vulnerability. It's a pretty high number if you think about it. Some of them are dumb. It's like, oh, I didn't clean up this memory. I'll never hit this, but we have to mark them as such. Rust is going to help us get rid of some of them. It's not going to help us get rid of others, but we document them now. So now we have a documented trail that if you ship a device, you have 700 CVEs that are outstanding on your device. The legal people aren't going to look too kindly at that, right? It's going to be fun to watch out how that goes. I know Red Hat's coming up with a document that said, here's all the CVEs that are not applicable for our product. And that's good because, again, if we have all these things, majority of them are not applicable. So they're having to change their ecosystem. But the quantity of these IDs that are out there is just huge now. It's not just us. We're not the largest contributor of CVEs. Just everybody's now realizing that we have to document all the vulnerabilities in all our open source products in order for people to be more aware for their ecosystem and for their supply chain that they do need to update and they do need to fix this stuff. And it's not like these bugs weren't there in the first place. They've always been there and we've always been fixing them. We're just documenting it now. So we've always been fixing bugs at this rate. It's just that nobody ever was paying attention. And now there's actually a paper trail to get you to pay attention a little more. Again, it's just hacking the ecosystem of the vulnerability databases, but it seems to be working.
So this is a question that I've had since you started doing the every bug is a CVE. I mean, given that the CRA is really focused towards Internet of Things kind of devices, because that's what's proliferated into the consumer market, the vast majority of them are running Linux as the basic operating system. You're putting out 10 CVEs a day. So how does a Internet of Things, how does the Ring doorbell stay current so that they aren't running afoul of the CRA with that level of frequency with vulnerabilities being issued? How does that work in practice? What is your expectation? How do you see that working?
So originally it was like you can't ship a device with any known vulnerabilities. And my response was that known to who? Me? Known to you? If you just close your ears and don't pay attention, then you didn't know any bugs were there. We're going to hash that out. I'm part of the subcommittee to working on the CRA. Our first meeting is next month to hash out how that's all going to work. Because it's also going to work like, do we need to have a European reporting agency for all these bugs, and including the CVE, which is US based, right? Or can the European work with the US one? Because then we have to normalize the database, and Japan is spinning up their own, and India is spinning up their own. How do we work through this stuff and how they interact? And at this rate that we're going, it can't be a manual type of thing. I mean, 10 for me a day. I'm not the biggest contributor. We're the second biggest. We're not the biggest. So there's other people pumping them out in much larger quantities, or just the sum of them all is huge. So it's going to have to be an automated system. I don't know how that's going to work out. I'll tell you how Android works out. Android mandates that you have to update your device every X number of months. I don't know what the number of months is. You notice you'll take a Samsung update, a Pixel update once a month. That's their latest kernel version with all the fixes at that point in time, and do that. If I can see devices updating within 2 to 4 months, I would love it. 6 months. Give me 6 months updates. If you're only 6 months out of date, I'd be very, very happy. The number of open bugs you have would be so small. The problem is today they don't even do that, right? There's 6-year-old kernels in there with things that are just so wide open. It's just not even funny. So anything's going to be better than that. I don't know how it's going to work. It's going to have to be some rolling update, but just get on a cadence and say you're doing the best you can, and here's what they are. And again, identifier. We're giving you in a machine-readable form all the information that you can use to then identify whether this is even applicable to you or not. So you can filter them away pretty easily. It should be simple to do that. Worst case, you're looking at 10 a week. I can cruise through 100 lines of bugs pretty easy once a week. You sit down and have your engineer look at them. Do I need these? Yes, no. Okay, great. Take them and away I go, or things like that. It's just going to be a continuing engineering process. And I don't know how it's going to be written down into legalese. I'm part of that process. I'm just one of the 60 people that's part of that process, but I want to be involved. So hopefully to put some sanity into creating something that will be able to be followed. Because it's not just open source, it's closed source. Again, Windows and OS X have the same rate of change of bugs. So it's not like open source is unique here. So there's Windows in a lot of things right now.
Well, closed source is based on open source. So
very much so. Yeah, Kernel's and everything, right? 106, 108 different operating system Kernel runs on. Yeah. So they have 3 CVEs a month, right? You got to update your stuff.
The Cyber Resilience Act is going to mandate that manufacturers, if they find an exploited vulnerability, they are obligated to not just report it towards the EU Commission and relevant agencies, but also to the makers of that software component. And the makers could be open source communities. And the manufacturers aren't just obligated to report the vulnerability, but if they have a fix, they are also obligated to share that fix with the community. It points towards the responsibility from the manufacturer's side in taking part of maintaining that upstream code base. And I think that this is a very important milestone because now we have a regulation in the EU that points towards companies having to have upstream investment in the projects that they rely on. So hopefully that is a step towards having more players in this ecosystem who won't just be takers anymore, but will also take an active part in communities and the maintenance work that has to be done in order for open source projects to remain sustainable. We did have a great conversation during season 2 with Michael Dexter, and he is one of the organizers of the Portland Linux Unix user group, or as they call it, Plug. And the user group has been in existence for over 30 years now. And sustaining a user group for this long, or sustaining most things for this long, is not trivial. Both user groups as well as communities who are working on source code, writing, designing, developing, maintaining source code, they're all groups of human beings who are there because of a common interest. And when it comes to the dynamics of these communities and getting involved and creating a structure that is sustainable, creating processes and workflows that are sustainable for the people who are participating, making it easy for new people to start to participate, that is not trivial. So in this coming segment, Michael Dexter will share some tips and hints from his experience of being with Plug for a long time to shed a light on what you can focus on to keep open source projects as well as user groups sustainable for the long run. Enjoy this segment. When you were talking about the sustainability topics, if I understood it correctly, what you were saying is that simplicity is key, and I assume consistency is also key. Because I'm trying to understand, like how you have people sticking around for a longer period of time. Because I think Plug, the Portland Linux Unix user group, it's been in existence for at least over a decade.
Yeah, 30 years. Torvalds came to our 20th and 30th anniversaries earlier this year, 94 to, I guess I should know that, to, 2024.
So, and how long have you been involved in the group?
Oh, since Late 2000. What was it? I guess 96. Well, it was 94. So 96ish, 98, which was, I guess, pretty early in those days. And that's when Linux was coming online and it was all the rage. And IBM put $1 billion into Linux, and it was, hot stuff. And fortunately, Portland has a large enough tech community, be it Intel out in Hillsboro, be it Tektronix, be it all these vendors, that there's plenty of people here. It's absolutely sustainable. I feel for those who are genius in a small town with just no one to even discuss these topics with. That's where online needs to supplant that. We can't always talk to our family members about these topics. It's just not, it's just this different thing. It's almost like a foreign language that we speak. In many regards, we can use the same mechanisms for separation that way. So I'm trying to think back to the pre-lockdown times of what distance communication meant, because that was engagement, but it was mailing lists, it was IRC, it was chat platforms, it was the dozens of chat platforms. And if I were to put one big banner up, it's just, don't drive people off. I've seen countless communities, non-technical and technical, that just, for whatever reason, and if we're going there, a great many people are on some form of spectrum, and I believe that it might even be required for some of this to keep a data structure of a kernel in your head may require a special brain, and developers can be very blunt for whatever reason and be off-putting by their bluntness, despite the fact that they're just stating the facts. They're not attacking you. They're just explaining the allocator or something. So, putting different people in the same room doesn't always have the effect and result you're expecting, because, well, they're all related to, say, Linux. I'll just say Linux, GNU Linux. Some might be very low-level developers. Some might be new users. Some might not look like the others. And it's tricky to navigate. So I'm not saying we should segregate people. That's a horrible notion. But we have to find those optimal means of communications between these new users and advanced users. And we absolutely can't tell people, oh, that's a dumb idea, and they just don't know. Well, what version of Linux does FreeBSD use? It's like, well, that's a nonsensical statement, but you just have to politely explain that it is, rather than yell at somebody. So I guess those are all wetware issues. The humans have to be nice to each other and tolerant and patient, and that takes leaders who are not purely technical, because there are a lot of non-technical skills. I'd argue the non-technical skills in a community are just as important as the technical, but everyone has their opinion on that topic. Purely technical is problematic. Purely non-technical doesn't advance the cause. It's fascinating. Although, is documentation technical? I suppose there are times you have to know exactly what's going on to accurately describe that. Are you wanting to focus on new users or retention of participants? New participants or retention? Because like I said, the big sign to put up is just retain people in whatever way you feel necessary, and please get help if you think a bunch of aggressive tech people who are geniuses who want to reach out. Well, we have to educate them on what it looks like to be gentler with the broader population. And wow, at some point, people realize that typically the money is outside of core technical groups. And if you are to make friends with organizations with money that want to help what you're doing, first, yeah, it is a challenge to explain what you're doing. Well, we want to do a new kernel allocator. I'll just pull some random example out of thin air. That's a very hard pitch. But if you can make that pitch, and there's a sympathetic company that says, yeah, we'll put in N number of dollars, euros, CapEx, whatever, that is exactly what they're after, but they probably don't even realize that. They think there's a technical solution to all things, and that's their worldview, and they will do the portion that they can do within their confines of free time and day, and you name it, and the speed of their processor for compilation, you name it. So I think, and I'll say thank you for any of these efforts, be it a foundation to, in some way, any way, merge technical and non-technical engagement. It's easy to be blind to it, but we're doing it right now. I encourage every viewer to do the same in your community, be it, what is it? Think globally, act locally. Just that is not a joke. That's true. I verified that is the case. Just think about the 3 people who have never really met and only briefly met in the same building, 2 of us. Well, if you remove those barriers to continued engagement, this is exactly what it looks like, and the results are fantastic. And hopefully, the legislators of the world just kind of, I don't want to say get out of the way and let us do it, but to some degree, just get out of the way and let us do it, because just trust the process. And with a balance of transparency and enthusiasm and a little money and pizza and you name it, magic happens. That's the paradox that is free software.
Last but not least, we also need to talk about how companies can work towards integrating upstream work into their product development workflows. And some companies have figured this out already, but this is not something that is trivial. So there are various ways how companies are tackling upstream work, and there's always room for improvement. And one of the big conversation topics in this season was InnerSource, which technically means that companies utilize the workflows, processes, and tools that open source communities use. And especially within larger companies with multiple departments, it is shown that utilizing InnerSource methods, it actually helps with collaboration between teams within the same company. And because sometimes teams are actually blocked to work together between multiple departments within the same company, which you would think should be something that is trivial, but it is actually not. So looking into how open source communities work can also help companies to become more efficient in what they do internally. And at the same time, if people start to learn the workflows and also some of the tools, if the company is using a tool internally that open source communities use as well, GitHub can be a good example, or some of the CI/CD tools, Jenkins, Zool, come to mind. So as people are starting to use these tools and methods, they also are able to collaborate with open source communities and start participating in open source communities much, much easier. There is a foundation around this effort. It is called InnerSource Commons. And in this season, Phil and I talked to Tom Sadler, who has been participating in InnerSource Commons. And he's also driving efforts to put these processes in place and help the teams and organizations within the company to be more efficient. And with Tom, we covered some ways of how his team and organization approaches this internal work on open source, things like time allocation and how their teams are structuring their work and dividing time between internal tasks and upstream work. Enjoy the segment. Is there kind of a knowledge base as well that you're building, or are there any practices in terms of how to share knowledge within the company and just raise awareness and help people to get into the practices, help them to know which tools to use? Are there any tools that you're building in-house or more depending on available solutions?
Yeah, so I'll say for security, we're mostly just relying on Dependabot. I think we're using Snyk in some other places. And then for the licensing, that's an internal tool that has the webhook set up. Although I would like to then integrate that with some of the more powerful open source tooling that's available. In terms of the knowledge base, we do invest a lot in communities of practice. So I talked about 10% time, but some teams actually get an additional 10% time on top of that for communities or guilds. So I know the kind of Spotify guild model was very popular a few years ago, and we took that on.
Can you tell a little bit about that model? I'm personally not familiar with it.
Yeah, so it's giving people some time and space to form a group that will work on business problems that aren't getting addressed in day-to-day work. So you could argue that it's an anti-pattern. It's like, well, why aren't these business problems being addressed, sort of Monday to Thursday? Fridays is when we do guild time, 10% time. And a lot of the time, like over time, guild work will raise the necessity for investment in teams to solve these problems that were being solved by guilds. But yeah, it means that we're encouraging people and enabling people to work on problems that are work related, but don't get prioritized, and also enabling that to be a cross team group of people as well. So we had things like we had multiple CI/CD guilds to try and make more sense of our CI infrastructure. And actually, a lot of that work then did get folded into full-time teams as it was recognized, okay, we need to invest more in our CI. We need to have a full-time team taking ownership of this. So having those guilds sometimes results in things getting folded into full-time work, but guilds can also be a really powerful knowledge sharing tool. Building up documentation, building up maybe tooling that isn't production critical, and things like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting model.
Yeah, a lot of our communities are more lightweight than having like a day to work on problems and almost have like their own backlog. So, for instance, we have an open source guild, and we have a backlog of documentation improvements and tooling improvements we want to make. So we get to work on that every other Friday. But other communities will kind of be the more knowledge-based communities of practice, and will take the form of it might literally just be a Slack channel. So actually, as well as the open source guild, we have just an open source Slack channel where we share stories of what's going on in the industry, share challenges that we're having in our jobs and solutions. Just having a Slack channel seems to be a really simple way to get those things shared and get that knowledge disseminated. But we also have communities of practice that will run lunchtime learning sessions where they'll get speakers from across the BBC to talk about, for instance, what their CI/CD practices or security or any other technologies that are shared across teams.
I think that's pretty cool. I think we had, as you were talking about what the guild is, I think we had something like this at Ericsson when I was still working there a long time ago. And yeah, I remember I liked that. Sometimes it's nice to also to break up the work days a little bit in terms of, there are all the high priority things and the customer demands and this and that, depending on what team you're working with or within. And then just have a day or even just a half day when you're like, this is something that I've been wanting to, fix or do for so long, but never had time for it. And yeah, you mentioned that we can argue whether or not that really is a priority thing, but sometimes it really does make an impact, even if it's only like you and your like immediate teammates' life. It's still an impact, and you can make improvements. So it was actually nice. I do have some memories of that now. But I mean, I was in Hungary, so I have no idea what code name, quote unquote code name we had for it. We probably didn't call it guild, but I don't know what it was. And with that, this was season 2. I hope you enjoyed the episodes during the season, and please comment below if you have any feedback or if you have ideas of what topics we should cover on season 3. Some of the things that are upcoming, we will look a little bit closer into the telecommunications segment and how they are approaching open source. We will talk about the intersection and relationship between business and open source, because that is always a hot topic, how to figure out the business strategy for a company who is using or relying on open source software, whether they are building products or services. We will also take a closer look at the automotive industry, which is another industry that is similar to telecommunications, that is relying on strict standards and has to comply with really strict regulations. So that is another very interesting and exciting space to discover how those companies and organizations work with open source communities and work within the open source ecosystem. So stay tuned for season 3. And also, I have some short segments for you throughout this little summer break on the Northern Hemisphere, so that you don't have to miss my open source experience podcast episodes. Look out for the mini ones, and see you back in September for season 3. And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about InnerSource, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no. Silver budget as well. Silver budget that is a silver bullet.
That's what you need, is a silver... Exactly.
That's it. Oh, and to be fair, some people...
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you